Excellent. Andrew, I think we have you on as well. Let me just double check that we're going to be able to see your video and hear your audio, and then I'll make sure Sweta joins us as well. Excellent. Andrew, are you able to hear us? I just want to make sure that we
Yeah,
can
yeah,
hear
I
you
can
as
hear
well.
you well. Can you hear me?
I can hear you well. Terrific.
Okay, good,
We'll
great.
be getting started in 7, 8 minutes here, but welcome to it.
Okay, thanks. testing.
Terrific. Excellent. Welcome, Sveta. Let me just make
Hi.
sure that we can
Good
hear you
morning.
as well. Sweta, I think you just spoke and we're on mute. Could we just see if we can hear you?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Now we can hear you fine. That's great.
Okay.
I was mainly testing to see if we could hear you.
Okay. Yes.
We'll be ready to start in just a minute or two here.
Sounds good.
We're going to begin in just 1 minute. Good morning. Very much looking to this plenary session. Um, for those of you tuning in, this is the National Silicon Valley Community Foundation, Knight Foundation, Miami Community Foundation, TechCrunch, ReframeIt, online dialogue of the technology community about immigration policies and immigration reform. We have with us today 3 distinguished plenary participants. Among those, Sweta Khandelwal is the principal attorney at the law office of Sweta Khandelwal, a firm specializing in U.S. immigration and nationality law. She has been recognized as one of the top 40 under 40 immigration lawyers in California by the American Society of Legal Advocates and is the chair of the Silicon Valley chapter of the American Immigration, or was Lawyers Association, or was until recently the chair of that. In addition to Ms. Khandelwal's professional experience in the field of immigration law, her personal experience as an immigrant to the U.S. has provided her with an extensive knowledge of the challenges faced by employment-based immigrants. Welcome, Sweta. The next plenary participant that we have is Andrew Weiner. Andrew is a senior immigration policy analyst for Bread for the World Institute. He has served as a researcher and analyst in immigration communities and has contributed to Congressional Research Services reports, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the National Journal, and Detroit News, as well as peer-reviewed academic journals such as Migration and Development in Practice. Welcome, Andrew, to this plenary.
Thank you.
The third plenary participant is John Miano. Mr. Miano has been with the Center for Immigration Studies since 2008 as a volunteer and has shared testimony in D.C. about immigration issues before a congressional subcommittee related to this issue. His area of expertise is in guest worker programs, particularly in how they affect the technology workforce. Mr. Miano has a BA in mathematics from the College of Worcester and a JD from Seton Hall University. Mr. Miano is also the founder of the Programmers Guild, an organization committed to advancing the interests of technical and professional workers. Thank you, John, for joining us today. So we have 3 terrific experts to answer the questions that have been prepared by the participants today. I'd like to ask that we can proceed to respond to the questions and also have a little back and forth among plenary participants to agree or disagree with one another about the substance of what we're discussing today. So let me begin with Group 1, moderated by Julie. First question that Group 1 asked is, can anyone prove that an immigrant has come to the U.S. purely to benefit from our social services? Can immigrants benefit from the U.S. social services in place? Can they obtain services if they don't pay into the system, other than schools and emergency rooms? Who would like to answer that question? Let me repeat the question. Can anyone prove that an immigrant has come to the U.S. purely to benefit from our social services? Can immigrants benefit from the U.S. social services in place? Can they obtain services if they don't pay into the system, other than schools and emergency rooms?
Can I just state the obvious then? I mean, it's that probably there's some that do. I would doubt it's the majority that do, and that that they can collect benefits. But it's not something you can sit down and say, yeah, that 90% of immigrants do. I don't think most immigrants come to the U.S. to collect benefits, but probably some do.
May I add to this?
Sure.
Well, first is immigrants definitely do contribute to the system, whether by way of income taxes, sales taxes, direct or indirect taxes. So whether there has been extensive studies conclude that the contribution that immigrants make to the local economies and the state economies is phenomenal. Well, if I'm trying to understand the perspective of the question here, if the perspective is, or if if the person asking the question wants to know if all that immigrants do is just extort from the system by way of Social Security or Medicaid or whatever. That's definitely not true. Most immigrants actually pay taxes. They file the tax returns, regardless of whether they're lawfully in the US or not. And whether or not they pay their taxes, they definitely have to contribute to the economy by way of sales tax and other indirect taxes.
Thank you, Sweta. Andrew, would you like to also share your perspective on the question or the comments of your fellow panelists?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's possible to know for certain why people come here, but there have been surveys and studies on why immigrants come here, and I think the majority shows it's for economic reasons, and most of them come here to work. And if you look at, for example, particularly undocumented immigrant men, they tend to work, are involved in the labor force at much higher rates than U.S.-born men. So, you're talking about, when you talk about immigrants, you're talking about many tens of millions of people. Even with undocumented immigrants, you're talking about 11 to 12 million people. And as the gentleman said, there's a whole variety of reasons why people come here. But I think if you look at the research and just working in the communities, the reason people come here more is to work. And undocumented immigrants, many of them are barred from most social services, from getting welfare services and whatnot. Once legal immigrants, there's also restrictions on that, but legal immigrants can and do take advantage of some social safety net programs. So I think it's hard to say one way or the other completely, but I think in my experience overall, the vast majority of immigrants come to the United States to work.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm looking forward to sharing the subsequent questions because we'll be returning to some of these issues in the course of the day. Let me now turn to Group 4 and ask their first question, which is, why does it take so long to process visa applications? What steps does the visa application process entail for longer-term visas? How are future reforms aimed at streamlining the visa application process? Let me ask that again. Why does it take so long to process visa applications? What steps does the visa application process entail for longer-term visas? How are future reforms aimed at streamlining the visa application process? Who would like to take that?
Yes, I like to take that. So first, I'm assuming that the question is directed to long-term visas, meaning immigrant visas and green cards. Why does it take so long is it's a complex question, and I wish I knew the answer to that in totality. But to sum it up, the first problem with the long-term visas are the way that the number of visas are allocated. So let's just take the example of an employment-based visas. So if there are a total of 140,000 long-term employment-based visas available in a year. Now this number is a creation of statute. Okay, so the statute provides for 140,000 long-term visas. Now these visas are allocated equally amongst the nationals, amongst all countries. So, each country has 7% of the availability, which means that countries like India and China have the same number of visas allocated to them as, say, smaller countries like Switzerland or any other country. So it logically follows that the demand for visas in India and China is far higher than the numbers available. And this is what leads to a backlog. So this is what that's why every person who applies for a visa is given a number and is put in line. And depending on when the number of visas are issued, your turn in line can come maybe 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, depending on your nationality and the visa category that you're applying for. So this kind of partly explains at least how long it's taking for some countries to get visas as compared to the others. And another interesting thing is, and I mean, it makes absolutely no sense that when you talk about the number of 140,000 visas, it includes dependents of the workers. So if there are 140,000 employment-based visas available, this would count the worker, the principal worker, and his dependents, which really makes no sense, right? If there are 140,000 visas available for workers, why should their family members eat into that pool? So I mean, apart from eliminating the per country cap, which was proposed in the Senate bill, so some of us are arguing for some administrative reform, which does not necessarily, which does not require legislative action. Uh, it may not be the ideal solution, but until Congress gets down and passes laws, we are at least hoping that we can get some relief by way of administrative action. And say one way for it, for administrative relief to work, is to exclude the dependents from the pool of the visas available. This would substantially increase, the number of visas available for the workers, thereby reducing the waiting time. So there are a number of ways in which you can expedite processing. I'm not even just talking about processing time that it takes for the agencies to work on the visas. I'm talking in terms of just availability, demand, supply, and how can we, change things at a fundamental level to ensure that the processing is much faster.
Thank you, Sweta. That was very helpful. Let me turn to John or Andrew and see if one of them would like to chime in response to the question or to Sweta's comments on it.
I'll make a brief comment if you'd like. I mean, part of this is history, that the immigration system, as it was set up in 1952, was based upon historical norms of immigration. In 1965, we changed that to a policy of diversity. So that we wanted to spread the immigration benefits around the world. The concept of eliminating the per country caps, it would be a radical change of the policy from one of diversity to a policy of India-China migration. There was also one other thing that we could do to fix this problem, is have an immigration system that makes decisions. Rather than people having queuing, that when a person, that we, every year or every 6 months, we take the applications that are made, and then we grant them to certain people, and then the rest of them we say, sorry, you didn't get it. You didn't get it. You can reapply, but you didn't get it this year. As far as the dependents under the 140,000 visas, that's in the statute. The statute says the dependents are supposed to be treated in the same way as the principal. So I don't know how they're going to change that with regulatory action without being hit by a flood of lawsuits.
Just to mention, in the briefing materials, that is one of the proposals that was identified as, I think it's from within the Senate bill. So some of the Senate bill proposals have been shared in the briefing materials with all participants, and so the question may have been alluding to the briefing materials in that regard, John. Okay. I just want to then turn to Andrew. Did you have other commentary on either what John said or what Sweta said, or the question?
Well, just real briefly, I think for guest worker programs, at least, I think your one issue also is you're going through several government agencies. I believe there's like the Department of Homeland Security, there's the State Department, there's like the Department of Labor. So I don't think government in general is known for moving super fast and efficiently. But when you're talking about applying for visas through 3 different government agencies, it's definitely gonna lead to part of the reasons, at least in some guest worker visas, some of the reasons that this takes so long and it's so slow.
I'd just like to add one thing, that when you look at the visa bulletin, from almost every country, the numbers are wide open. So these long delays are really restricted to just nationals of a few countries like India, Mexico, the Philippines, and China. And for example, if we got rid of the per country caps, then we would be exposing the delays that we have now for just those countries to absolutely everyone. So it's one of those things that I think that sounds good until you look under the covers and look at the details of what it would cause.
thing that I would like to add is to address the argument of diversity. You have a separate category of diversity visas, which are only restricted to countries which are not well represented. So that definitely should take care of the diversity problem.
Thank you, Sweta. Thank you, John. Let me now turn to the second question of Haley's group number 2. The question is, why should we be catering only to STEM students while those who are studying non-STEM degrees may bring other benefits to the country? Let me repeat that. Why should we be catering only to STEM students while those who are studying non-STEM degrees may bring other benefits to the country? Who would like to take that?
I can first start out that there is really no such thing as STEM. In fact, I'm involved in a case right now where the government is arguing there's no such thing as STEM. So STEM is just an artificial creation. So the setting up of policies to address STEM in itself is ludicrous. So I don't see any reason why STEM should be treated any differently from anyone else.
Sweta or Andrew, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I definitely think that it's non-STEM fields definitely do add value, so there is no reason to eliminate them from the immigration benefits. And even the way STEM is classified, it's sort of subject to debate. So for instance, I believe dentists are not classified as STEM fields for whatever reason. The other argument is the accepted shortage that U.S. has for STEM workers. That probably puts a greater thrust on the argument that we need more science students, technology students, to ensure that U.S. retains its competitive edge in the international market.
Andrew, do you want to comment on this one as well?
Yeah, again, just briefly, I think it's been covered pretty well. But I think however you define it, and I get it's open. I guess there's a debate around it. But I think the reason it gets special treatment is because there's an idea there's a shortage of these sort of students in the economy or these sort of workers in the economy, and that the economy would benefit from that, and that the U.S. economy needs those workers in particular. So I mean, I think that's why, obviously that's why there's this focus on STEM. On the STEM field is because it's a key part of the economy that's missing. Although many people dispute that, but certainly there's a lot of data that is the case.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me now turn to the next question, and we can also return to some of these points as we go through. So Ilsa's group number 3 asked in their first question, how much on taxes are we going to earn if we turn undocumented immigrants into documented immigrants? Is there an estimation on the cost gain net of turning undocumented immigrants into documented individuals? Let me just ask this one more time. How much on taxes are we going to earn if we turn undocumented immigrants into documented immigrants? Is there any estimation on the cost gain net of turning undocumented immigrants into documented individuals? Who would like to take that?
Maybe I can touch upon that. So I don't know the number exactly, but for anybody interested, the Congressional Budget Office did an estimate of the Senate bill, of the economic impact of the Senate bill, which includes a legalization program for I think most undocumented immigrants. So and that has a lot of data and a lot of numbers in there. It's easily accessible on the internet, and I think the Congressional Budget Office is regarded as a pretty neutral, objective source. So anybody interested in sort of the economic impact in terms of the fiscal impact, in terms of the economic growth impact, in terms of the impact on U.S. workers, I would refer them to that. I don't know the numbers exactly off the top of my head, but it was definitely a positive number for a lot of the obvious reasons that you'd be adding people. Some of the people who aren't on the tax rolls would be added to the tax rolls, and so they'd be brought in to be paying more into the system.
Sweta or John, would you like to comment on that?
I would just say one of these.
It's the same. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, John. Yeah.
I was just say I think that this is one of these things with dueling studies. You know that people on different sides of the equation. Some are going to show that's going to be a net drain because the amount of taxes is not going to cover the benefits. Other studies show Andrew said that there's going to be a positive benefit. I think the reality is no one really knows.
Can I actually just did a quick Google research, and I have the figures in front of me. It says the examining the Congressional Budget Office cost estimate of the Senate bill, and we agree that's a reasonably unbiased source. So the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the bill will significantly reduce deficits over each of the next 2 decades. It's $158 billion in the first decade, and about $685 billion over the next second decade, because higher tax payments from immigrants would exceed the increased costs resulting from the bill. So I've pulled this straight from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities from their website.
Thank you, Sweta. Let me now turn to the next question from Ilsa's Group 3, which is related. The question is, there are fears on providing a pathway to citizenship that would not deter people from entering illegally and only incentivize them. How would you address these fears while being pragmatic about those who are already here and undocumented? Let me repeat that. There are fears on providing a pathway to citizenship that would not deter people from entering illegally and only incentivize them. How would you address these fears while being pragmatic about those who are already here and undocumented? Who would like to address that question?
Maybe I'll go real quick on that one, if I may.
Sure.
So a couple things. I think those are definitely legitimate fears, you know, that you don't want to just keep doing this every 20 years, legalizing new batches. So I think part of it, though, is the flow of undocumented, unauthorized immigration has fallen a lot in recent years. So the flow of undocumented immigrants is on the way down. So there's just part of that has to do with sort of birth rates in places like Mexico and whatnot. So a lot less people are coming to the United States than they were like in the early 2000s and the 1990s and even the 1980s. So the flow is lower. And then also the Senate bill, you know, includes a lot of increased enforcement, tons of increased enforcement, both in the interior with E-Verify, would be mandatory E-Verify for, you know, in, workplace enforcement, I think for the vast majority of employers in the United States. And then also at the end, I think they dumped what? I forget what it was, how many billions of dollars they wanted to dump again on the border for increased enforcement, 20 billion or something like that. That was negotiated, you know, in order to entice some Republicans to sort the bills. And this is after a, you know, 10, 20 years of escalated border enforcement anyway. So there are safeguards against, you know, just having the legalization be an incentive. You know, any sort of legalization program that's ever going to pass is going to include a pretty hefty increase in internal and border enforcement.
Thank you, Andrew. I know, Sweta, you were trying to speak before, so let me allow you to chime in at this point.
Yeah, I think this is it's well summarized. But the only thing I would like to add is that any comprehensive immigration reform requires you know, efforts at both ends, not only making efforts to integrate the 11 million in the society, but at the same time ensuring that the borders are controlled well, and we prevent influx of further undocumented workers. And any policy which emphasizes only one aspect of it fails to look at the complete picture.
Thank you, Sweta. Let me ask John, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, I'd like to go on. This, you know, this is somewhat out of my area because I do, I primarily do labor stuff, but I rely on my background here in computers and mathematics and of a rational system. And one of the things is when you provide an incentive, you get what you incentivize. For example, in 1986 we had about 3 million people here illegally. We gave an amnesty then, and now we apparently have 11 million plus. We had the president give an administrative amnesty to children. Now we have a flood of children. So whatever we do, whatever we give the incentives, we're going to get the behavior that we provide incentives for. One of the things I'll strongly disagree with is that comprehensive reform requires dealing with the problem of people here illegally. We should fix the system first. I mean, if you're sitting in a rowboat and the rowboat spouts a leak, the first thing you do is you plug the leak. You don't bail the water out because you keep on getting more water. So just from a rational basis, you would say you need to get the system fixed. Then you can deal with the violations that have taken place. The last thing I would say about this is it just seems from a rational basis, if you want to end this problem, any kind of legalization that we do now, after having failed before, needs to have a never again clause. There needs to be in the bill that in some bill that gives any sort of legalization, amnesty, whatever you want to call it, needs to have a provision that says, okay, we've done it now, but if you come here illegally or overstay ever again, you have no possibility of getting a legal status in the future.
So I just want to acknowledge that this is a plenary that is intended to reflect different points of view. So that for the participants tuning in here, you may be hearing different perspectives from our different plenary experts, but that is part of the goal of our deliberation, is to include multiple perspectives on these topics. Before I go to the next question, Andrew Sweta, do you have any other further comments on these last question or the comments of your fellow plenary participants? And if not, I can return to the next question.
Be good.
Yeah, well, I guess I just like to say real quick. I think John definitely makes some good points, but also as as a mathematician, there's different variables, right? And so, there was an amnesty in 1986. I mean, is that what drove more undocumented immigrants to the United States? I mean, the amnesty wasn't the only thing going on in the world. There was like a booming U.S. economy that needed jobs. There was poverty in Mexico that drove people north. There was, a larger group of young people, working age people who needed jobs. So, I mean, I think to attribute it only to one thing, only to the amnesty, although that could have played a role, there's a lot of other things going on in the world. There's a labor market in the United States. There's a labor market in Mexico. There's demographics. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot to measure in terms of what's incentivizing people to come here and what's not incentivizing. It's not one thing, it's a multitude of factors.
That's a fair statement, and I just say that this is one of them. So I think we're pretty much in agreement.
Thank you all for those points. The next question that we have, unless I'm mistaken, relates to the student visas and the optional practical training requirement. I only mention that because the question itself was framed with an acronym. So why is OPT focused on field of study as opposed to ultimate field of employment? This is from group number 4. Let me ask that again. Why is OPT, which I believe is optional practical training, focused on field of study as opposed to ultimate field of employment? Who'd like to take that?
I'm up to my neck right now in a lawsuit involving OPT, so I think what is being referred to is that under optional practical training right now, training up until 2008, the government was granting students, people who came here on student visas, 1 year of work after they graduated, and I guess we're no longer students. Now, again, with the STEM thing, if the DHS calls you a STEM worker, you can get from 29 months to 35 months on OPT. Why the difference? Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense to me. And the government's documents on why they're doing it don't make any sense either.
Thank you, John. Let me repeat the question for Sweta and Andrew's
Thank you.
benefit, because why is OPT, optional practical training, focused on field of study as opposed to ultimate field of employment?
Well, I don't. I can make a rational guess as to why it is. It's an understanding that when a foreign student is here studying, the training that the student would get should be related to the field of study. I mean, if you've come here to train to study for an engineering degree, then you're expected that your training would be in the engineering field. You are given an opportunity to apply whatever, to get practical experience with the companies here, to apply whatever you've studied as part of your curriculum. If uh, Now, if the OPT was related to something totally, something not to do with the field of study, I imagine people would use it to get employment. What happens if a student uses the OPT to work in a restaurant or in a gas station or wherever? That's not the underlying purpose of the OPT. So it sort of makes logical sense for me that the OPT should be related to the field of study, and your ultimate job should be related to the field of study as well.
Thank you, Sweta. Andrew, do you wish to comment on these points or these?
No, I think this question I'll leave to John and Sweta. They have much more expertise than me on this piece, for sure.
Yeah, I think I think the two of us are interpreting the question differently and answering it. So I'm not sure there's any great disagreement here.
Okay, we can then proceed to the next question. So the second question from Julie's group is, immigration backlog seems to slow everything down. What has created the backlog? Do any of the current proposals account for what occurs after the bill passes to improve system efficiency and address the backlog? Let me phrase that one more time. Immigration backlog seems to slow everything down. What has created the backlog? Do any of the current proposals account for what occurs after the bill passes to improve system efficiency and address the backlog?
Okay, I can take a shot at that. I think my previous response did cover some of the issues raised in the question as to why is there a backlog. I'm kind of emphasizing more on the employment part of it because that's what I mainly do. And one of the ways, as I said, for eliminating the backlog was to eliminate the per country caps, to at least remove the dependence from the pool of the limited number of visas available. The other proposals that were there in the Senate bill was to sort of exempt STEM workers from the pool of 140,000 visas. So that would make things a whole lot easier, at least for STEM workers, though that may raise other concerns about why only STEM and why not others, but that's a different story. Also eliminating the other interesting, when you look at the process of securing an employment-based long-term visa, you go through a process called the labor certification or the PERM. And the idea behind the process is to protect the interests of U.S. workers. So only if an employer is unable to find qualified, able, and willing U.S. workers can the employer go ahead and offer the job to the foreign national. So some proposals, maybe in key industries where there is a shortage of U.S. workers, you could eliminate the process of the PERM. But again, I'm not addressing the other issues that will arise from doing something like this. But these are some of the proposals that were there in the Senate bill. All of them were aimed to reduce backlog and make the process much more faster.
Thank you, Sweta. John or Andrew, who would like to go next on this?
Well, I'll speak up if Andrew's not. But I say in a rational immigration, if we had a rational immigration system, something that's not in the Senate bill is that there shouldn't be any backlogs. That we should have an immigration system that makes decisions, not queues, so that a person makes an application within 6 months, 3 months, a year, they get an answer. yes, you're going to be an immigrant. No, you're not. Sorry. Apply again in a few years, so that the people get an instant answer and know where they stand.
I mean, just to kind of, I don't see how this is kind of a system is going to really work, because again, it doesn't change the fact that you'll have so many more number of applications as the number of visas available, and I can't imagine people kind of applying every year. I mean, there has to be a basis. Either you are doing a lottery every year, and the other thing that we have to remember is that people who are already here on temporary visas, they have lives here. People who are on H-1B visas and they are on their path to a to a green card, have kids in school, have jobs. It's kind of, I don't see how a system like this, at least however flawed the current system is, it at least gives them an opportunity to continue their lives as is and not put a hold on it for, like, it's some would argue otherwise, but I don't imagine how a system suggested by John. It seems too simplistic to be implemented.
Andrew, would you like to comment on these points of your fellow plenary experts or the question?
Yeah, I think the question, just real briefly, I think this is something that's being considered now by, I think, the president in the executive action. There is, we may see some changes to this sort of the legal, not just a legalization program for unauthorized immigrants, but also some changes. This was proposed in the Senate bill, parts of it at least, and I think there might be something coming out in the executive action that addresses the backlogs and addresses the legal immigration system.
Thank you. So the last question of these is partially addressed to myself as one of the organizers and partially addressed to the plenary. So I'll just read it and then respond briefly and then see if the plenary experts would like to respond as well. From Haley's group number 2, wrote, quote, "We are curious about the affiliations and priorities/agenda of the folks putting together the Google Hangout and document. How much is this a coalition? How much is being driven by Silicon Valley industrial leadership dependent on H-1B holders for staffing? In some cases, it feels like the pro and con argument is not the best one for the category." So I just want to share the briefing materials were prepared after a 9-month process with 8 briefing committee members who do represent a diversity of points of view on the subject. Subsequent to that, 2,000 technology community members, driven by TechCrunch's articles on the subject, showed up at the briefing document and made more than 300 comments. There were 78 subsequent revisions to the pros and cons and other aspects of the briefing materials based on that collective feedback. There is a grant from the Knight Foundation that supports this project, but I wouldn't say that is. The Knight Foundation received its funds from newspaper industry many years ago, not from the tech industry per se. I would say that the briefing committee was selected, as well as plenaries, in concert and collaboration with the representatives from TechCrunch editorial. So this has partially been framed in that kind of way. But as far as the question of the pros and cons on H-1B visas, and I'm going to leave the substance of the question as far as the middle part of that question of how much is being driven by Silicon Valley industrial leadership on H-1B visa holding for staff, and do we reflect the arguments pro and con correctly on that? For the substance of the question, I'll turn to the plenary experts that we have with us.
Seems you answered that question well.
Andrew, would you like to comment on this, or?
I think it's an open. I don't. First, I should say I don't really focus on the H-1B program in my work. I mean, I know about it generally, but it's not. That's not something I work on closely in my immigration policy research and analysis. But I do know enough about it that I think it's an open question. There's there's a lot of evidence and data that there is a shortage of like STEM workers, for example, the H-1Bs, and they're not being filled. But then there's also a lot of people who say that companies in Silicon Valley and other places are using the H-1B program because they want to pay less and they want to bring in foreign workers that they can exploit and take advantage of. So, and I think it's an open, it's an open discussion on both sides that's continuing. So, I don't know enough to really answer the questioner's or the participant's question, but I think it's an ongoing sort of debate that, in my view, hasn't really been settled.
Thank you.
Maybe I'd like to. Yes. So I just have, again, I would broadly agree, and I would like to add that the reason it seems to be driven by a lot of tech companies here is because 2/3 of requests for H-1B workers are for STEM occupations. So that sort of would logically explain why a lot of advocacy is coming out of the Valley. But that being said, it's not just the consulting companies, or those companies have, for some reason, they've got a bad rap. But it's also being driven from high technology companies like Google, Facebook, Yahoo, which really, they just hire the best talent. And they pay. You cannot argue that they are using the H-1B programs to sort of get cheap labor or but so a lot of the advocacy does come from these high-tech companies. They do have the lobbying effort and the power to make a difference, and and also the reason why it's coming a lot from the Valley is because most of these H-1B visas are for STEM categories currently.
Thank you, Sweta. Let me actually ask one last question, which is from Haley's group. They added an extra question because that one question was relatively meta. So this question is, should the U.S. be concerned about the brain drain that may appear in other countries when we take their highly qualified citizens? Let me repeat that. Should the U.S. be concerned about the brain drain that may appear in other countries when we take in their highly qualified citizens? Who would like to take that question or begin with that?
I'll make a quick comment. That's sort of related to something I look at a lot in my work, and that's sort of like the connection between international migration policy and like international development and international economics, which is, if you're pro or anti-immigration, usually just is totally absent from the immigration debate in the United States. And that's sort of, what is, and we talked about that a little bit earlier, it's like what are driving people to the United States, and particularly, undocumented immigrants, a lot of times that's, poverty, generally a lack of economic opportunity, and specifically poverty many times. So, yeah, I think that, we need to be, in designing our own immigration policy, it is a national policy, but I think we do need to be cognizant about how our immigration policy impacts other countries also.
Thank you, Andrew. Would John or Sweta like to also chime in next on this question?
I could throw in one thing, is that it's interesting how the policy, at least the marketing, has been changing over the years. That if you follow, for example, student visas, the legislative history of student visas, all the way up to the last major revisions in the immigration system in 1990, paraphrased legislative history, Congress was expecting that foreign students would come to the U.S., that they would learn about our culture, become our friends, return home, and go back and be our ambassadors overseas. And now we talk about marketing student visas. We train them, why are we sending them home, which is a very recent thing. So I think that what the questioner is describing is a very recent aspect of American immigration policy and the marketing of American immigration policy. And historically, that has been a concern, but one that appears to be fading away.
Thank you, John. Sweta, would you like to respond to this question?
Yes, well, I'm not really an expert on global migration, but to address Joan's concern about cultural exchange, I think there are specific visas that are reserved for only for that purpose, the J1 exchange program, where the focus is essentially on, promoting students as ambassadors of their culture here and vice versa. So there are a specific category of programs, visas that are specifically reserved for that purpose. But I definitely don't see why, the best and the brightest of the world have to come here, get educated in the top universities here, get resources, get even scholarships, aid, funding, and go back to their home countries and get them to benefit. So that, to my mind, definitely doesn't make sense.
Thank you, Sweta. So with that, let me see whether any of the plenary experts would like to conclude their remarks with any final responses to the prior questions that we've received in this plenary or to the comments of their fellow plenary participants. After giving each of you just a minute or two to speak at the end of this, then we will conclude this morning plenary session. Andrew, would you like to have any further? Oh, Sweta, please.
Okay. So I think I'll just kind of broadly conclude with saying that there is no dispute economically or otherwise that immigration is not beneficial to the U.S. This is the country for immigrants. Historically, America is what immigrants have made it to be. So definitely there is no dispute to that. I would also argue in the merits of what we call comprehensive reform, that emphasizing just one aspect of immigration reform, like border security or internal, control, would definitely be undermining.
Sweta, your mic just cut out. We can't hear you. Let me let you finish when you have.
No, yeah, sorry. Here, yeah. So there is no dispute. I would definitely like to emphasize that stressing on one aspect of the reform, as in only emphasizing on tighter borders or only emphasizing on internal on verify without without corresponding reform in the other aspects of it, is definitely not going to get us anywhere. We need an immigration policy that makes sense. We need to work on all aspects of it, and we need to do it in a way that we are able to preserve the U.S.'s supremacy over over retaining intellectual talent.
Thank you, Sweta. Andrew or John, would you like to speak any last words on this plenary session in response to the questions or the comments of your fellow plenary experts?
I'll make a final comment, and that is that what I think we need to have is an open discussion of immigration, kind of like what you're having here, because what we had in the Senate bill was, I think, considered as a national embarrassment, where we just created a lobbyist feeding frenzy of backdoor deals and created a bill that was a total mess. The immigration system was created in 1952 in 1,500 words. What was being proposed here for reform is 180,000 words, and it's total gobbledygook when you go and look under the covers. For example, in the H-1B sections, there are some notorious provisions that inhibit enforcement. The way the bill reforms it is simply rewords the provisions so there's absolutely no change. It takes the quota on H-1B visas, turns it from a paragraph into 4 pages of absolute nonsense. So what we need to have is a bill of under 20,000 words that everyone can understand. That the participants if we have real immigration reform, the participants of these sessions should be able to read the bill and understand exactly what it's doing, something that we don't have now.
Thank you, John. And our goal in this dialogue is partially to frame the issues that are underlying both proposed legislation and the current status of this, so that we can have a discussion around what reforms make sense to the tech community upon consideration. Let me allow Andrew to share any final remarks.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just real quickly, based on what other folks said, I think the majority of policymakers, of analysts, and I think of Americans, the general outlines of what immigration reform should look like are pretty clear, and I think people agree on them. Of course, there's disagreement on some of the details, but I think the broad outlines. It's been studied for a long time. It's been debated for a long time. I think the broad outlines of what should be done are pretty clear. It's just sort of getting past. I think John alluded to some of the lobbyists, the extremists. I would say on both sides. Getting past the extremists on both sides because there are on both sides, and getting to sort of a middle ground and a compromise, which in the U.S. Congress is pretty challenging right now.
Thank you, Andrew. I want to express gratitude for the participation of Sweta, Andrew, and John on this plenary today. I think we've had a terrific chance to get some important questions addressed for the technology community. Now for the participants, you'll be returning to your small groups. There'll be a short continuation of the small group discussion, and then your moderators will indicate when it is the time for the lunch break. We're also going to be asking the moderators to collect all email addresses from the participants who have arrived in the small group so that we can ensure that participants get their appropriate honorarium and raffle tickets for the TechCrunch Disrupt tickets. What I can say is that this national online dialogue of the technology community, co-sponsored by the Knight Foundation, ReframeIt, TechCrunch, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, and Miami Community Foundation, is moving through this Sunday, September 7th, to its conclusion. We're grateful for all the participants for taking the time to both participate in the dialogue and to fill in the surveys at the end of the day. Thank you again for the plenary experts for your participation. With that, let us adjourn, and good afternoon.
Thanks, Bobby.